cost curve, and you get the distortion from the marginal distortion from adverse selection at this little wedge here. And the Harburger triangle is the intersection of the demand curve with the marginal cost curve. So this is the size of the distortion that's caused by adverse selection. OK. So the thing to notice here is that this is a pretty small little triangle here, right? And the reason is because this average cost curve is hardly downward sloping. And so there's not too much of a wedge between that and the marginal cost curve. We don't have anything like something that could potentially cause market collapse or something like that, right? Yeah, go ahead, James.
Can you just explain again how they managed to get the marginal cost curve?
So once you have the average cost curve, right, we can just take the slope of the average cost curve, and that tells us what the marginal cost curve is, right? OK. So it's not just this study. There have been several other studies related to this, which have found that adverse selection is pretty small. And in fact, there might even be advantageous selection in many cases, right? And this was, I think, a bit of a letdown, because there was a huge literature about adverse selection. And then you went and looked at it, and we found these very small effects, right? And so it seems like we sort of were a little bit wasting our time. The question is, why did we find so little adverse selection in the world? Now, one thing could be that there's just not very much adverse selection out there. But can anyone think of another reason why we might not have found much adverse selection? Like in this example, why in this market did we not find much adverse selection?
So
James? Yeah.
You can't see what's not there.
Yeah. Go on.
So if adverse selection is really bad, then you have no markets at all.
Yeah.
And so you're not going to see the things that are not there.
Yeah. So notice that this strategy depended on us seeing these positive quantities here and then tracing out this curve. If the market is collapsed, you're not going to, quantity is going to be equal to 0, right? And so you sort of should expect that adverse selection will be relatively mild here, right? Nathan Hendren, who was on the job market last year and did very well, he got a job at Harvard, he investigated he investigated exactly this hypothesis, right? He thought that we were getting not very much adverse selection because we were looking in markets that hadn't collapsed, right? And how did he try to address that issue, Daiichi? Oh, I see.
Markets that collapsed.
Yeah. So what might be a good example of a market that has collapsed? Where might you look for that sort of thing?
Like bankruptcies.
Yeah. I mean, another thing that you could do is you could look at people who can't get insurance at all, right? Because that's a good example of a market that's collapsed, right? If an insurance company won't give you insurance at any price, that's market collapse, right? And there are lots of people who can't get insurance at any price, right? And he wanted to try to figure out whether selection was a cause of that, right? And so what he did is he looked at a survey of the people who weren't getting any insurance. And he looked at people who could get insurance and people who couldn't get insurance. And they all had gotten a survey which asked them to predict what was the chance that they would end up going to the hospital or getting some sort of a condition in the coming years, right? And the problem is going to be, right, what's going to cause market collapse is if those people know a lot better than insurers do whether they're likely to get sick, right? So we would expect that anyone who knows a lot better than an insurer could know or could price on whether they're going to get sick, that those would be the markets where we wouldn't expect to see insurance, right? And then what we can just do is exactly think about average cost pricing. So we can say, OK, let's take the distribution of people's knowledge about whether they're going to get sick in the future or not. And we can actually figure out how good they are at predicting whether they're going to get sick, right, by regressing their predictions about their sickness against whether they actually end up getting sick in the future, right? And through that, we can sort of construct their estimate, subjective estimate of their cost, of how likely they are to get sick, right? And then we can say that imagine people only get insurance based on that. The only thing that determines whether they want insurance is how likely they think they are to get sick, right? We can then say, how sick is the average person that would buy insurance at a given price? And how sick is the marginal person that would buy insurance at a given price, right? You can just construct that from the distribution of people's knowledge about how sick they're likely to be. And you can figure out how big is the wedge between those two things, right? And that gives you exactly the thing we were talking about before. And so we use that in a bunch of different markets for people who had certain congenital conditions, for people who were a certain age or a certain gender or whatever, to construct how big you would think in that group the adverse selection wedge would be, right? And then he ranked all the different groups he could think of in terms of that. And the really interesting thing that he found was that those wedges were all above some threshold in the markets where you couldn't buy insurance, and were all below some threshold in the markets where you couldn't buy insurance. So that adverse selection wedge provided basically a perfect explanation, a perfect prediction of which markets would collapse and which markets wouldn't collapse. And he therefore concluded that adverse selection was exactly what was causing these markets to collapse or not. And therefore, all the cases where we went to look at the markets that actually existed, and we found a small amount of adverse selection, was just a result of this censoring, right? It was just a result of the fact that we were taking all the markets where the adverse selection was below some wedge, right? So here's an example of one thing from his paper. He took the set of all people who couldn't buy insurance at any prices and all people who could buy insurance at prices. So the rejects are the ones who couldn't buy them at any price, and the no rejects are the ones who could buy them. And notice no rejects in terms of how much they predicted they were going to get sick. They were all sort of clustered in this little part around here. Whereas the people who couldn't buy insurance at any price were way spread out. And that meant that there was going to be a big difference between the average and the marginal person. Because the marginal guy here is dealing with all these average guys over here. Whereas the marginal guy here is only going to deal with the average people over here, right? OK. So the same types of approaches here can or cannot in insurance markets. So if we think about regulating insurance markets, remember we talked about ways to solve the average cost pricing distortion was to move to marginal cost pricing or price discrimination or something like that. So any policy that can be used to get us to the optimum in the case of a regulated monopoly could also be used to get us to the optimum here. So for example, we could provide subsidies for insurance the same way that providing subsidies for firms can let us get to marginal cost pricing. And what were the problems with subsidies to get us to marginal cost from average cost pricing before? How do they show up here? Anyone want to? Here for Shank.
Wouldn't you have the same problem with you used average cost pricing because you're in the entire demand curve?
Yeah.
So can't you have a similar sort of thing?
Exactly. So if you tried to move to this, you'd need to know how many people in the population should be insured. Otherwise, you could go overshoot in all sorts of ways, right? If you tried to provide too many subsidies for insurance, even though this is a popularly advocated solution, you need to know the whole cost function to be able to figure out how do you actually get to that marginal cost, right? It's perhaps a bit easier given competition because you can sort of observe more things. but it has same dangers of capture by the insurance industry, right? The insurance industry, once you're down to that marginal cost pricing, right, could be asking for all sorts of subsidies, trying to convince you that the marginal cost was even lower than it was so you could get more subsidies. Yeah, go ahead, Rishon.
Well, I was wondering, like, if, I mean, this may sound hard, but
Yeah.
like, in the paper that, like, you just referred to,
Yeah.
he talks about, like, the market failures, and, like, disability and, like, people who are, like, long-term.
Yeah.
And, like, all of those people. And if you're providing subsidies for, like, those, to insure those people, isn't that an overall, like, net loss to society?
Well, I think the biggest net loss to society is that people might have an incentive to become that way.
To become disabled?
Well, it would at least dampen your incentives to avoid becoming disabled, right?
Okay.
That's one potential issue. So how about a mandate for universal coverage? That's basically like, mandates for quantities, right? Daiichi, why would a mandate for universal coverage potentially be problematic here?
So perhaps some people have like such high costs that it wouldn't be justified for us to socially provide.
Well, I mean, insurance we think should always be good, right? Because you're dampening people's, you're providing them insurance. And so if you provide them, fair insurance, if they're risk averse at least, that should not, transferring the cost to society should always be a net improvement. But why might it not be a net improvement?
For the same reason we were discussing earlier
Yeah.
about like providing improper incentives to avoid savings.
Exactly, like the thing with Vrushank, right? I mean, if the people have moral hazard, right? If people might not take as good care of their health if they know they have the insurance, then it might not actually be efficient to insure everyone, right? And there also might be administrative costs of providing the insurance, right? That might lead us not to want to have everyone have insurance, right?
Do we have it?
Yeah, James.
Sorry. Do we have very good evidence, any good evidence, in fact, for the idea that people's taking care of their health is particularly elastic to how well insured their health is? Because I kind of feel like it wouldn't change my decisions that much if I knew I'd got insured, because the fact that you get treated is really quite small compared to the fact that you're having health problems.
There was an estimate of this by the RAND Foundation, the RAND Corporation, was that the elasticity is about 0.2. So that's larger than I might have thought, but it's not huge. I mean, the other thing is there's all sorts of other problems with insurance. Like, so for example, you could go get a basic treatment at a basic hospital, or you could go to some super, super fancy hospital that's insanely expensive to get your treatment. If you're totally insured, you're not going to be paying much attention to that, right? Mohammed, did you have a question?
Yeah, so this is about when we have total insurance, but we
Yeah.
can manage that question. Like, so the way I saw mandates was as a subsidy to the insurance industry, for example, because those people that are not coming and don't come and get insurance are like most.
Yeah, but if everyone's mandated to do that,
and like,
then that causes everyone to be insured, and if that's not efficient.
Like, for full insurance, that's not efficient. But if you put a deductible there, then you can solve the problem of moral hazard, for example. Like,
Yeah, but that's assuming that every person has the same degree of moral hazard, right? If you mandate that everyone gets insurance, then you're giving the same deductible to everyone, and that's assuming that
It should be the same for everybody. We're mandating, but we study case by case and assign different.
Well, but if you don't do that, then there's going to be adverse selection between the different plans, as we were just talking about, right? So I don't think you can really get around it. We also said that perfect price discrimination could solve the problem, right? And Jim, what might be the problems with discrimination in this sort of a market? What problems might that cause?